Okay, so in this video, I am going to do a quick run through of the 2021 interpretations question for paper 1. So it's section C of Britain, 1625 to 1701. So here we go. I've done another video on the exam technique for these questions, so I'm not going to talk as much about exam technique. I will a little bit, but I'm mainly just going to kind of talk through this paper and how you could approach it. So the question is, in light of differing interpretations, how convincing do you find the view that it was the financial revolution of the 1690s rather than the glorious revolution of 1688 to 89 that changed the relationship between the monarch and parliament? Okay, so we're going to get stuck into that in a minute. You can see the extract 1 from Smith and extract 2 from Morgan. We're going to get stuck into those in a second. But before we do that, here is the kind of steps that you should follow for these questions. So read the question and highlight the key terms of the question. Then read through the extracts and summarize the argument of each extract into a bullet point. As you're reading through the extract, highlight key quotes and then think of own knowledge to support or challenge the quotes. Also, once you've done that, you should think about differences between the arguments, why they differ. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do in this video, just following those steps. Okay, so here's the question. So the key aspects of this are the financial revolution of the 1690s rather than the glorious revolution of 88 to 89 that changed the relationship between the monarch and parliament. So what you're really thinking about is, was it the financial changes rather than what has been considered the glorious revolution, the events of 88 to 89, that changed the relationship, changed this power balance between the monarch and parliament? So in another video I've done on this, I've talked about the kind of key overarching questions, and that's one of the overarching questions, isn't it? The power balance between the monarch and parliament. Also, finance is another kind of question. So this is incorporating those two together. So in other words, was it finance or the events of 88 and 89, the glorious revolution, that changed the relationship between the monarch and parliament? Okay. So we've identified what we need to do. We've highlighted the aspects of the question. Here is extract 1. So I'm not going to read through this. You can read through it on your own. And what you can do is pause the video and read through it and try and do this yourself. So you could put a bullet point. What do you think the overarching argument is? You could highlight key quotes or note down key quotes, and then think of own knowledge to support or challenge. So if you want to do that, you could pause the video now and have a go at doing those things. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly run through this. As I said, this is kind of instructional video. I'm not going to read through things line by line. So what's the overarching argument of Smith in extract 1? So the overarching argument that I get from this is that basically William III's reliance on Parliament for finances in the 1690s meant that there was a shift in the balance of power. Okay, so William relied heavily on Parliament for finances, and therefore that meant that they were able to kind of use that against him and gain more power, if that makes sense. So here are some, and I always say try and pick out 3 key quotes, and I'll come back to that at the end. So here's a good quote. The Crown's desperate need for tax revenues transformed Parliament from an occasional event into a permanent institution of government. Okay, so, you know, you could look back to Charles I, where he just saw Parliament as a place to kind of raise taxes and could be dismissed and dissolved. And he obviously did that multiple times in his reign, compared to William, where he really relied heavily on Parliament. So what do we know that can support or challenge that? So I'll come back to that in a second, actually. Sorry, another key quote is, Parliament was in a position not only to withhold its consent to taxation, but also to dictate and scrutinise how tax revenue was spent. So that's another key quote, that Parliament was now in a position to kind of really question how things were being done, scrutinising finances. And in the video I've done on finance, I talk about that quite a lot. Another key quote is, this idea of the power of the purse became much greater than ever before, and Parliament made increasingly frequent and ferocious use of it. I think that's a really, really good quote about the impact of finance and the shift in this balance of power. So in terms of key evidence that we could use, so for the first quote, you could use evidence about the 9 Years' War, the cost of the war, and how much that cost the monarch, how much that cost William, and therefore he would be increasingly reliant on Parliament to do that. Okay. For the second quote about scrutinization of public spending, you've got the Public Accounts Act, and you could use that to support this idea and say, yeah, this view is valid because of the Public Accounts Act and the Public Accounts Commissions that were set up. If you wanted to take it even further, you could actually do a counterpoint and talk about how the Public Accounts Commissions were limited later in the 1690s. More on that in the other video that I've done on finance. And then in terms of the power of the purse, you could talk about the Civil List Act and how really Parliament were in the dominant position by the late 1690s. They were able to really set out, how much the monarch had. So you can see the three pieces of evidence there to support those quotes really is supporting this argument. You could pick out other quotes. There's many other places you could pick out. Again, I'm just giving you some examples of how to approach it, but these are pretty supportive, aren't they? This is backing up the argument of Smith. So your overall summary in this first paragraph is going to be, yeah, Smith's arguments are largely convincing. If you go along with what I'm saying, you may disagree with me, and that's absolutely fine. That's what interpretations are all about. So Morgan, again, you can pause this, and what you can do is identify the argument, highlight some key quotes or note down some key quotes, and then think of evidence to support or challenge. So what is Morgan arguing in extract 2? Again, I'm not going to read through this myself. You can pause it and do that. So the overall argument of Morgan is that it was actually the events of 88 and 89. They were revolutionary in ending absolutism, in ending divine right, and we're now at a point where we're moving towards kind of constitutional monarchy, basically. So it's 88 and 89 is really the thing that alters this balance of power, in contrast to extract 1. So the first key quote that I've pulled out here is the change of course carried out in 1688 to 89 can be seen as a truly revolutionary. So really saying the Bill of Rights, the Glorious Revolution, William and Mary coming to the throne, really revolutionary shift. The next key quote that I've pulled out is this one. Fundamentally, the Glorious Revolution can be seen as a historic turning point involving the decisive rejection of an entire form of government, a historic turning point. And then finally, Glorious Revolution introduced the concept of a rightful king who owed his title to a decision of Parliament rather than the theory of divine right. So you can see how all of these, this idea that it was the events of 88 and 89 that really changed, that altered this relationship between the monarch and Parliament. Okay, so you should be starting to think, well, what evidence do I know to support or challenge that? So for this one, really the evidence I've got is to challenge this. You could find evidence to support it, and that would be absolutely fine. But here's just ways that you could challenge it. So I've said for the first quote, this idea that 1688 to 89 can be seen as truly revolutionary. I think you could challenge that and say, arguably, it's not unprecedented. The Petition of Right, was in 1628. Parliament had asserted there that the power before and the limits of the monarch's position previously. And actually, the Bill of Rights itself was limited, that it was vague. There wasn't any mechanisms of enforcement. Arguably, it was more, the Bill of Rights was more of a political compromise rather than a significant shift in the balance of power. And then you could contrast that with what happens later in the 1690s, where the power balance does shift. Going on to the next point, fundamentally, the Glorious Revolution can be seen as a historic turning point. Again, I think you could challenge that and say it's true to a point that it rejects absolutism, but the monarch still had the power of veto. William did use his veto. You could actually counter that point and say, but Parliament kind of forced through the Triennial Act despite the veto. But the monarch also had powers of patronage, could still go to war. So the monarch was still the head of state, the head of government. So arguably, it's not the decisive rejection of an entire form of government. Lastly, Glorious Revolution introduced the concept of a rightful king who owed his title to a decision of Parliament rather than theory of divine right. Again, there is evidence you could use to support that, but I would say, just to show you how to challenge this, you could say this was maybe the case with the Restoration in 1660, that Charles II was, it was Parliament who made that decision after Monk's intervention, and arguably so Parliament decided to bring back the monarchy in 1660. Also, the execution of Charles I undermined this concept of divine right. So again, if you looked at this and thought, actually, there's ways I would support it, that's fine. But I'm just showing ways that you can challenge this using your own knowledge. So in terms of the structure, this is the structure that I suggest. So paragraph 1 is focused on extract 1. Paragraph 2 is focused on extract 2. Point is what their overarching argument is. So the bullet points that we've got there, you can see just at the top there for extract 1. The bullet point, that would be the point in paragraph 1. Then you use the quotes to illustrate the argument. Then you use your evidence, your own knowledge, to support or challenge. And then the judgment is, therefore, is this convincing? And I would say aim to do that 3 times with a summary at the end of each paragraph saying how convincing. And then in conclusion, so you're kind of pulling it together here, you're answering the question, discussing the differences between the arguments, the interpretations. So, for example, in this one, extract 2 is quite narrow. It's focusing on 88 and 89, whereas extract 1 has got a broader scope. So you're really setting out the differences and then answering the overall question, and saying which is most convincing. So you could use this as structure using what I've gone through in this video to kind of write out a really detailed essay plan. So I hope that's been useful in kind of pulling that together. I know it's been quite quick, but I just wanted to quickly run through that as an example paper for section C. Thanks.